Doug Simon from Tredas is our market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture released the May World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates last week. World stocks were closely watched as the USDA increased soybean totals for old crop by 50 million bushels. The report suggests new crop ending stocks for soybeans will drop by 4.5% year over year. As we record this week's show on Thursday morning, China and the U.S. are still having trade discussions. For the second round of discussions, they're currently in Washington, D.C. On the other hand, the world corn stocks for old crop ended nearly 1.5% lower than the USDA April estimates. World new crop corn ending stocks are projected to fall 19.5% over a year ago. We spoke with Doug Tuesday afternoon and began by asking him about these WASDE numbers.
This is the first time USDA puts together acres from the March 30th planting intentions and then also the yields. And then they throw together all the supply and the demand, the use numbers for next year. And it was really interesting report. Actually, the soybean carryovers came in at 415 million bushels, and the big surprise was that they actually increased the exports for soybeans versus last year by 225 million bushels. And with all the trade war talk that's going on, it's interesting to see that USDA was that confident to boost those exports. The U.S. attaché had some high numbers earlier on exports, or it'd be imports by China, and so maybe they're getting a little bit more confidence from that. When you look on the corn side of it, the acres were at 88 million acres, and we had known that number, the yields at 174, but on the use side, they actually boosted the ethanol side of it, again, which is encouraging, but they cut feed use and they cut the export use there. So the actual corn carryover number at 1.7 billion bushels was a little bit below that. Came in just a touch above the trade expectations, but on the soybean side, that 415 million bushels was on the lower end of the expectations. They were looking anywhere from 375 million bushels up to over 700 million bushels. So that 415 million bushel number was encouraging. It really cut down the carryovers on the beans.
USDA also released their price projections for this 2018-2019 crop. Any surprises in those numbers?
Well, it's always interesting to look at what they're using. When you look at last year's numbers, they were using a $3 to $3.80 average price on the corn side of it. The bean side, they were $8.30 to $10.30, so they had a $2 range on the beans. This year, they boosted that floor on the corn to $3.30, and then the upper end of the range is $4.30, so they've got a dollar range there. And this is an early estimate. It'll be much more accurate when we get out towards September, obviously. And on the bean side, they're $8.75 to $11.25. So that floor has been boosted because of that tighter U.S. stocks numbers at 1.7 versus a number last year that was 2.2 billion, and earlier season estimates were up towards 2.5 billion. So those numbers are much more attractive, and the bean carryover at 415 versus last year number in that 500 to 520 million bushel range. Those numbers are tighter, and it's given us more encouraging prices.
Following the WASDE report, how did the markets react? We're always watching those.
Well, the beans came out of the gate because of that drop and that big bump in the exports, and jumped up quite a bit. But now when you look into this week, today, bean prices are back in that, what did they end up? 10.22 on Tuesday. Our recent high has been up toward 10.60. So even with that encouraging news, our carryovers aren't, they're tighter, but our prices aren't back up to those highs we put in earlier. Beans today were up in nickel, and they finished at almost 420 on the day. Our recent highs on there have been 424. So actually the corn is actually not too far off its recent highs, which is encouraging.
USDA released their crop progress report on Monday, and farmers are now making up some of that. They were once behind a little bit, but they're making up that pretty quickly. What are we watching now as it comes to crop progress?
Well, it seems like those numbers have been lagging the last couple weeks versus when we talk to the people we work with. Nebraska corn farmers are pretty much done planting corn. Beans are really finishing up too. Last week they said 62%, or on Monday was planted versus 69% last year. The bean side of it, 35% planted, which actually 29% last year, so we're ahead of pace on the beans. There's more farmers trying to plant beans earlier, thinking they'll get some yield advantage of that. The places where we're lagging, South Dakota's 40 points behind what they were normally. Minnesota is about 25 points behind their normal pace. Iowa's about 5 points behind their pace. So that South Dakota border area into into Iowa and Minnesota is wet, and that's where they're behind. But I think that over time they're going to get that planted.
There always seems to be volatility in the marketplace. As we wrap up here, how do we manage some of that volatility?
Well, we look at our crop insurance guarantees, and that's a value that we want to try to sell year in and year out. That's why that crop insurance guarantee is there, to give us some encouragement to sell. And so we want to go out. Corn is, for example, we'd like to be about 60% of that seasonal average sold. So if somebody's going to raise 100,000 bushels of corn and they've got 70% crop insurance guarantee, that'd have about 60% of that sold. So that's about 40 to 50,000 bushels sold. Now, you can, going forward from here, which we think you still need to be selling those increments over time, you want to look at maybe doing something with some puts, or if you hedge, buy some calls, or if you do a hedge derived, keep some flexibility in there. We always kind of look at keeping some calls as a part of our portfolio in case we do have some type of weather. And that's one of the things, is that we have warmer conditions down south, and it's been drier relative to where, if you look at that drought monitor. So I think we're set up in a situation with those tighter acres, those smaller acres, tighter world stocks, tighter U.S. stocks, that we could have some more weather volatility, but we still want to stay. Our plan is to continue to sell increments. Bob Wisner, famous Iowa State economist, says, sell your corn when you're putting it into the planter box. So it's that time of the year to be selling corn and soybeans.